Hello and good morning. Good afternoon. I'm Debbie Himmelfarb, Director of Daytime Programs for 92Y Tribeca. Thank you for coming. Has anyone in this room been to Gail Saltz's series so far? Let me see, raise hands. Good, good. So you know that this series is called Psychobiography, and Gail has chosen interesting people in history who have, how shall we say, an interesting sort of...
Have things to overcome.
Things that they overcame. We featured Van Gogh, we featured Hemingway. This is our third in the series. And I want to give you a little advance notice for what we have planned for the spring. On Monday, January 28th, Gail will be focusing on Harry Houdini, great escape artist. And on Monday, February 25th, on Mozart. So if you want to mark those down. Also, we will have our winter-spring program up online right after Thanksgiving, so you can take a look then. Hello. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Gail Saltz, Dr. Gail Saltz, who I understand was on Today's Show today. Did anybody see her on the Today Show today? Okay, great. We have a celebrity in our midst. Gail is a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, columnist, author, and TV commentator. She's also a frequent speaker uptown at the 92nd Street Y. You may have seen her up there, and we're happy to say she's now doing programs for us here in Tribeca, and we're thrilled. Today, I talked to you about the new programs for winter. Today we're looking at a fascinating character, Howard Hughes, and we have an expert on Howard Hughes in our house too. Jim Steele is contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He and his reporting colleague Donald L. Bartlett are among the most widely acclaimed investigative reporting teams in American journalism. They've worked together for more than 4 decades, first at the Philadelphia Inquirer, where they won 2, count them, not 1, but 2 Pulitzer Prizes. And then they were at Time Magazine, where they earned 2 National Magazine Awards, becoming the first journalist in history to win both the Pulitzer Prize for newspaper work and the top prize, the magazine equivalent, the top prize for magazine reporting. So congratulations for that. I have to come over here to show you that they are co-authors of, I need one more hand here. They're co-authors of The Betrayal of the American Dream and most relevant, thank you, Gail, most relevant for today, Howard Hughes, His Life and Madness. So that is our topic for today, and we have 2 experts here. So thanks again for coming. Please welcome Gail and Jim. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, thank you. And actually, both your books will be outside afterwards if anyone's interested, including your new book, which is very exciting. So Howard Hughes has gotten, I think since The Aviator, such a bad rap because he really was an unbelievably accomplished man, accomplished businessman, entrepreneur, aeronautical engineer, philanthropist, movie director, producer, and not as accomplished in his personal life, but he was one of the wealthiest men in the world. And it's really quite a story. So let's talk a little bit. Let's start with, as a psychoanalyst, where it all began, the beginning of his life. And it's kind of a curious story about his birth. He's supposedly born on Christmas Eve, 1905, although there seems to be some dispute. There's a record of his birth and then a record of his baptism, which claims a different birth date.
What happened was there's nothing on file with the Texas Department of Health where birth certificates are filed. We know that because we went there as part of our research. And in World War II came around, Hughes's aunts had to file an affidavit attesting to exactly when he was born because it had to do with his draft deferral and things of that sort. So why this disappeared, nobody's ever seen to figure out. But we made the point in our book that it's just typical of Hughes. The mystery surrounding
Another
him.
mystery.
Even exactly why this particular document disappeared is just another one of those things.
But he was born to parents who, he was an only child.
Only child. And the reason he was an only child is because after his birth, the doctors advised his mother that she should have no more children because it was such a difficult birth. And as sometimes happens in a situation like that, his mother was from a fairly aristocratic Texas family in Dallas. And
she was actually descended from
French Huguenots. Yeah,
exactly.
That went way back to the early part of the United States history. And the father was from a very interesting family in the Midwest. Grew up in a little town in northeast Missouri. One of those all-expense-paid trips that I had to visit this little town that had about 300 people in it. His father was a railroad lawyer at a time when railroads were extremely aggressive in terms of laying down track, putting things across the country. Railroads in the late 1800s are not unlike the technology industry today. Very similar kind of thing. But actually, many people argue that the railroads were far more significant in changing American life than even our technology has today, because suddenly people could get around. Anyway, that's the way you made money. That's what his father was involved in. I'm sorry, his grandfather was involved in. And then his father was one of these lovable characters who everybody, a hail fellow, well-met kind of guy. Everybody liked him. But he just bounced from one thing to another, never seemed to make any money until he married Howard's mother, who didn't have any money, but she seemed to be somewhat of a stabilizing influence. And as part of that process, he began exploring for oil. And in the process of exploring for oil, this is Howard's father, he came across the fact that everybody in the oil business was frustrated because they could not get a drill bit that would actually go into the ground and actually tap the reserves at a proper force. Every time one of these drill bits went in, it ground up and turned to smithereens. So his father, in conjunction with some others, invented a drill bit, which went by the marvelous name of the Rock Eater, because that's exactly what it did, of course. And that was the basis of the whole family fortune, the Hughes Tool
And when
Company.
he was smart enough to not sell the drill bits, but to
patent it.
patent it
and rent it.
And
lease
rent it.
Exactly.
So that people would become dependent,
Right.
essentially, and have to keep paying him, which was
Right.
how they really made their money quite, actually, not only engineeringly significant, but entrepreneurially, he was quite bright, too, when you start to think about where Howard Hughes got his ideas and, maybe even some of his endowment.
Right.
But his father made money, made a lot of money
Right.
then, and something that was important to the family as they started to live a nice lifestyle. But the father was absent a lot, right?
Father was on business a lot, various places, and so Howard basically grew up under his mother's wing, and he was early on also kind of a loner. He did not make friends easily, which again is something that we would see throughout his adult life as well.
Mm-hmm. In fact, actually, records sort of indicate that he was a loner and he sort of didn't do well in school.
Did not do well in
had
school.
A lot of
He
difficulty in
bounced.
school.
He was very similar to his father in that sense. He bounced from interest to interest, had trouble buckling down.
Mm-hmm.
There was another thing that emerged in his youth, though. His mother was quite concerned about his health. He apparently wasn't exactly robust in his youth, but she sort of overdid it. And
she had a fear herself.
She had a fear
tremendous
herself.
Fear of germs.
She had a fear of germs, and the way we found this out is typical. One of the reasons I love to do the work I do is you never know where you're going to find a discovery. You never know where something will be there. And what we do in our research is we tap manuscript collections as well as people. And at the Library of Congress, tap the manuscript collection. There's Howard Hughes' name in about 24 collections. Pull one of them. It's a fellow who founded the Boy Scouts. And in this file are letters from Howard's mother when Howard was in camp in Pennsylvania back in the 19-teens. Letters that said, please protect my boy. If there's anybody in your camp who's sick or in germs of any sort, isolate them, isolate him. I need to come see how he's doing. Will you bring him off-site to a hotel nearby so I can see exactly how my boy's doing? I mean, tremendously possessive in every kind of way.
So
and she actually used the term violent germs.
Violent germs.
I'm very concerned that
About
he
violent
would not
germs.
be exposed
Now,
to
in
violence.
fair-
This is as a kid who's not even a teenager yet. At
Right.
that
In
point.
fairness to her,
There were things
there was
around.
a polio
There were
outbreak.
there were polio
and
outbreaks.
and
right.
so everybody got, many people got a little
Right.
hysterical and started to understand that this was a germ and so on. But as is often the case for people who struggle with obsessive compulsive disorder or phobia of germs, there's always a kernel of truth to be found anywhere
Right.
because germs exist and people do
Right.
get sick. But she clearly had this ongoing and talked to him often about cleaning his body She was involved in
Exactly.
cleaning his body,
Right.
not necessarily such a great thing for a little boy. And what did he eat? What did he put into his
Right.
body? Was very concerned about that, which later clearly affected him. In he was quite concerned in different traumatic times what he put into his body. Had a lot of magical
Right.
thinking about what was curative and could fix the ailment, and what might be disastrous if he put in his body. And yes, she was constantly talking to him about concerns about him being sick. And in fact, I think in his adolescence, he became mysteriously paralyzed at some point, which he then completely recovered from. Doesn't sound like it was polio or anybody thought it was polio, but
It sounds very psychosomatic at the time.
like a hysterical
Right,
paralysis, which can really be brought on by your mother telling you constantly
Yeah.
that you might be paralyzed.
Right.
Particularly when you're an adolescent
Right.
boy, a very impressionable time. And he
Yeah.
was, and because he didn't make friends easily, he was really, this relationship with his mother had tremendous intensity.
Right.
And it's hard to know, what was a lack of ability to relate to others and make friends, as in some sort of Asperger or autism-like way of being, which
Right.
you wonder about, or how much was that he had to have such allegiance to his mother, who was all consumed by him and also didn't have anybody else.
Right.
That took such primacy. But clearly, the relationship with the mother was intense.
You talk about allegiance, and that's a good word here, because I remember talking to one of his aunts when the book was done, the research was done, and she talked about the way Howard behaved around his mother. It was with tremendous formality, basically walking up to her almost like, I'm at your service in every possible way. Whatever you want me to do, I will do. And this concern about the illnesses and the germs and things of that sort takes on special meaning based on what happens to his parents.
Right.
Because
So in his growing up, he, just before we get to what does happen, he showed a lot of athletic aptitude as a
he was
boy.
a good golfer, and apparently when he got involved in those kinds of sports, he did very well. I mean, the photo up here, I think it's
Yes.
anybody knows anything about golf can recognize that's a pretty good golf swing. And it's very similar to mine, by the way.
But he was, despite the fact that he was bright and athletic and good-looking, a
Yes,
good-looking
yeah.
young man, really, he wasn't thriving so well in the outside world. He really was concentrated with
Right.
the mother in the family, and then his mother died.
His mother went into the hospital in Houston. They grew up in Houston for a what they thought was a minor procedure, a uterine procedure, and died on the operating table, and my memories did not recover from the anesthetic. And
Well, she apparently, I mean, I had read that she had an ectopic pregnancy, which in those days,
yeah,
I mean, they couldn't treat so well.
they could not treat, and his father was devastated. Howard was
17.
at the time. His father was also devastated. From all indications, they were very attached to each other. And Howard was in boarding school at the time in California, and when this happened. Anyway.
So talk about your trauma. I mean, your mother is your world.
Right, and suddenly
You are away.
she's your way.
There are no siblings.
She's told you the dangers of illness and things that can happen to you out there if you're not careful. And lo and behold, she dies at that tender age. A year and a half later, his father, who was the picture of health to everybody, a very vigorous guy, traveling all over the country by rail, selling his drill bit, making more and more money, expanding the company, suddenly gets up from his desk one day in Houston, falls over dead, a massive heart attack. So here you have him. He's lost both parents at age 18. He's not really close to anybody else. His mother has some sisters who live nearby. His father had a brother, a very famous brother, by the way, who wrote novels, wrote screenplays in Hollywood. So the whole family came together to try to help out Howard. Mm-hmm. Howard didn't want any
Didn't really
help.
want that help, which would really set the
And-
tone for the way he behaved.
Lived his entire life.
His whole life.
Exactly. And this is one of the most interesting aspects of the man, is that he, for some reason, viewed them as intruding in his life. And I'm sure all of us have had relatives from time to time who intrude here and there, but you have to assume, and this was a case where they wanted to do the right thing. But he had been sort of indoctrinated by his father about the danger of having partners, business partners. So that's one of the things he took early on. What's fascinating to us about Hughes, and we make a big point of this in the book, up until that time, there was no indication whatsoever of this kind of ramrod streak of determination.
Rigid, right.
And go-it-aloneness. He'd been a cooperative kid. He'd obeyed his mother and father. He had been a good son. And then suddenly, the minute this happens, he's just suddenly given for this tremendous determination to determine his own life, determine his own future, much to the anger and upset of his other family members. When his grandmother, who was an interesting person in her own life, his grandmother and grandfather lived originally in Keokuk, Iowa, but also resettled in California at some point. When his grandmother died, I've never forgotten, the will was on file in Los Angeles County. And when I pulled the will, the last sentence of it was to the effect that I give my grandson, I think it was $1, and I want you to know I purposely am giving him just that $1, so that is the extent of the inheritance. I can't remember the exact term right now. We have it in the book. But the point being, there's some real bad blood here. I don't want him suing for whatever's there. Not that there would have been, but it was just indicative of
He
how
already
angry.
viewed him as sort of ruthless and independent.
Independent, totally ignoring the family, totally cutting. And this set the tone for Hughes's life. He felt in the beginning when he was so young, he needed no one. He was self-sufficient.
Now,
and the people he'd been close to had been taken from him,
I was just
so
going
what
to
does he
say,
need?
if all you have is these two people in the world,
Right.
as far as you're concerned, and then you have no control, they're taken from you.
Right.
The idea of trusting in an intimate relationship
Right.
would be severely fractured,
Right.
Particularly that you're in your adolescence when
Absolutely.
that happens.
The parents were very young. The father, I remember, is about 54.
Right, they weren't
and,
older
the mother
people.
was younger than that.
On the other
I
hand,
mean,
it was a different time
was-
when
right.
treatment for some of these things. If you had a heart attack, that was kind of it. If you had an
Right.
ectopic pregnancy, that was kind of it.
That's the kind of thing, obviously, today you wouldn't
But they
generally
and by the
die.
way, we'll make sure if you have questions, make sure you're writing them on cards because we're going to collect those and take those.
We'll
But
try to take as many.
as many as we can. But the thing is, so this feature of his
Yes.
that would become in some ways his greatest strength because he was not intimidated by what anybody had to say to him.
Right.
And he made very independent decisions. Often they were, at least from an entrepreneurial view, excellent decisions. But at the same time, it did keep him very isolated. He got himself legally emancipated at age 19 so that he could take his father's money because, of course, his father had been successful, and which was quite an extraordinary thing to do. And he took this money, and this was the beginning of his business career.
Absolutely. And the Hughes Tool Company, this is also an interesting psychological thing about Hughes. The tool company was always the golden goose of Howard's entire empire. That's the thing that regularly just produced the money that let him finance some other things, buy land, start Hughes Aircraft Company, finance movies. Even when you ran over budget, he didn't care. You could go a little bit farther to create the thing that you wanted. But one of the things that was so interesting about this is that we concluded pretty early on that Hughes's entire life felt he was living in his father's shadow. He felt his father's accomplishment was so amazing that he would never equal that. Now, you can argue in many ways he far exceeded that in both his early movie career, his aviation exploits, which we can get to in a minute, his founding of companies such as Hughes Aircraft, which became one of the great defense contractors, satellites. Hughes Aircraft, by the way, never really made planes, which is a subject of endless confusion. Actually, they made a plane in the beginning, but typical of Howard, names are not always what you would think, but it was a technology company, satellites, high-tech things, and was one of the great formative forces like that. And he brought to that all kinds of very smart, intelligent people who he just gave them their head. And whether they made money 1 year or not, he didn't care. He wasn't answerable to any stockholder except himself. But anyway, a lot of this stemmed from the father. He wanted to continue to try to outdo Dad, not because he felt he was better, but he just felt that was a monument to search for, to try to achieve.
And monuments he made, I mean, so that was one monument, that he should succeed entrepreneurially and surpass his father. And of course, to some degree, not to cut to the chase, but the Howard Hughes Medical Institution is something that he conceived of at 19 when he became emancipated, and he made a will at that time, right? And that there would be this medical institution that would be a legacy to his parents who had died, and very fitting for for a mother who was so consumed by illness and the fears of illness, which he also then had, but also that they died young and that he was helpless to do anything about it, that he would leave part of whatever his fortune would be. He had already decided that at 19.
He decided it at 19, and then a very curious kind of thing happened to him. After he executed a will when he was younger, then another kind of psychological thing developed, where in subsequent wills, because things are always changing and you have to allocate things in different ways and so forth, and his own assets obviously expanded. After that early will, when he's in his 20s, he then refused to ever sign a will after that, which is another interesting aspect of his psychological thing. As he got older, it became our opinion that he viewed this as his death warrant for whatever reason. He kept trying to say to those around him, you're in my will, but he never actually put them in his will. And now Melvin Dumar and Melvin and Howard, it's a wonderful story, but no, Howard didn't put Melvin in his will. So,
right. But a lot of people did try to take advantage.
A lot of people did try to take advantage of that, but that became his little vehicle to try to exert a little more authority over the folks who were immediately around him, and so forth. But you're right. I mean, medical stuff was a very big issue with him early on. Just because it was what he saw around him, and he himself had a number of medical things over time, which we can also get into.
So let's talk a little bit about his being consumed with the aviation.
Yes,
he loved to fly. The engineering aspect of flying was very important to him,
right.
Very fascinating to him, and again, he stayed very independent of others. These were his ideas,
right. And
his buys, his world records.
You're an excellent student of our book. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's exactly what he was interested in, and it grew out of his movie stuff too. That's what's interesting. When he first went to Hollywood, he produced a movie. The first one he directed and produced was called Hell's Angels, and if any of you have not seen this movie, get it from Netflix. I mean, it is actually a marvelous movie for its time. The original movie was filmed, and it was a silent movie. The talkies came in midway through it, and the actress who was playing the female role was Swedish or Norwegian, and that accent really didn't work well for an American girlfriend of American flyers in World War I. So he had to remake all of those things with a new actress and so forth. But the heart of the movie were these astonishing aerial sequences. Hughes bought upwards of 7,500 airplanes. He collected them from all over the world, World War I relic planes and so forth. And these were the subject of the flying sequences in that movie, and they are amazing to this day when you look at these things. They're so amazing, actually 3 pilots died filming the movie for that reason. So he became interested in aviation in California, he partly because of World War I. The aces out of the war had just kind of gotten in his head. After he filmed Hell's Angels, he began to think about aviation himself. Mm-hmm. What do you do here? And this is also a key to his personality. As shy as he was, as much as of a loner he was, great glory came to anybody associated with aviation in the 20s. I mean, that was the great movies and aviation were the 2 most dramatic new fields in America at that time. And that's where Howard was the minute he broke loose from the family and he had this money at his disposal. And in aviation, he began building small racing planes. And the first one was one called the H-1, which had retractable landing gear. It had such things as flush rivets, anything that aerodynamically increased the speed of the plane. From that plane, which set some land speed records in California, he then began to develop a couple of planes for cross-country flights. And in 2 years, 36 and 37, he broke 2 records, fastest times from west to east, flying from basically L.A. to Newark, New Jersey. On one of these, he lost his radio on takeoff and lost any notion of where he was. And so he flew by sight from Los Angeles to Newark, like 8 hours or something like that.
Right.
I can't remember the exact time right now.
So one
But-
thing
and
that's
looking at the lights of the cities as he went across
had to
from
just do
his
it.
memory of what was going on. A rather gutsy, pretty amazing thing instead of just turning back when this happened.
One thing that's
set-
fascinating is that on the one hand, you have this man who's very afraid of illness and germs, and apparently people would sit with him and he had to count his P's and separate. They had to be different, that he had a rigidity and a counting issue, which can also be part of obsessive compulsive disorder, where, he would have to separate his food and they had to be ordered and such. And he remained concerned about germs. And on the other hand, you have this man taking these incredible risks,
Right.
doing these things that no one has done before in these very glorious kinds of ways, but alone, or with just a few people. And it makes you think about, why would somebody be brave enough to take such huge risks? And often what you see in people who struggle with a lot of anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder, being in that realm of anxiety disorders, is people who do what's called a counterphobic behavior. That in order to contain their fear, they do really the opposite, the complete opposite. So, I'm not afraid of the water. I'm going to jump off the high dive into, head first into the water. And sort of, he had a lot of those, bravado filled, really, such that he had, he was in plane accidents. He had plane crashes.
Yes.
And where he was injured. I mean, seriously injured. And that did not stop him from flying.
It did not stop, and it's a good point you make in terms of this contrast, because I've sort of revisited him in my own mind since all of this, since we talked about having this session. And I think one of the things that's intriguing is, he had these obsessive compulsive tendencies for sure. And as he got older, these became more pronounced. In fact, can I digress here a second?
Yes.
There's a marvelous story about H.L. Mencken, the writer. In newspapers, for years, when somebody got old, they would write these obituaries prior to the time they passed away. I mean, I'm a newspaper guy, and this was just a common thing. Well, Mencken, the great sage of Baltimore, when he was quite old one day, was roaming around the office of the Baltimore Sun, and he came across a young reporter who was brushing up on Mencken's obituary, and he slapped the guy on the back, and the kid looks up. Mencken was terribly famous, and Mencken said, "It's okay." He said, "Just say as he got older, he got worse." So in a way, I mean, sadly, Howard's obsessive-compulsive things happened over time. But what's interesting, when he was young, because we talked about this, one of the ways we think he dealt with this when he was younger, he was a perfectionist.
Yes.
And he was able to direct that perfectionism into the 2 fields he loved a lot, movies and aviation. So in both these planes, in all of these planes he flew, he did everything possible to make these the highest state-of-the-art planes. And then in 38, when he has his famous flight around the world, where he actually has a crew with him at that point, and they break the world record of flying around the world. Hughes helped design the plane. It was a Lockheed plane. A lot of the instruments in it were path-breaking. One of the things that led to this, we were talking about how he was different, where he broke new ground. He experimented very much with high-altitude flying. He thought the higher you go, the faster you're going to be able to go, as long as you can keep your pressure suitable. And of course, this was revolutionary for aviation down the road. The other area where he was revolutionary was the case of just the big planes in World War II. Everybody's probably heard of the Spruce Goose, this giant airplane that he built in California. It's called a Spruce Goose because it's made of wood, spruce plywood for the most part. When you make something out of metal, every piece of metal is reasonably the same density and weight. This is not true with wood. I mean, just think about the complexity of making wings. I mean, this was the biggest plane. It may still be the biggest plane ever built. I'm not totally sure of that now, but for a long time it was bigger even than 747s. Every piece of wood in it, every inch of it, weighs a little different than the other inch. So you have to weigh this. Goes to the heart of Hughes. He did this during the war because he couldn't get the metal, but he wanted to do this to try to develop a big plane, and he got defense contracts to do it. Who in their right mind would try to build a plane of this size out of wood? But again, this is typical of Hughes's ideas, and he showed, even though that plane only flew for a couple miles, something that size needed jet engines, which really weren't around yet. It showed how big planes could become and what would ultimately be possible down the line. Goes to the heart of it.
So on the one hand, no one wishes to have obsessive compulsive disorder. On the other hand, his perfectionism, he directed it into two fields where, as you said, we hope you would be perfectionistic, building planes, flying planes, and actually movie making, so that he never let go. He would go on and on. He would wait for the right cloud sequence for that shot with the planes, and other people would be saying, oh, come on already, let's just get with it, we got to go, we got budget. And he was perfectionistic. I mean, sometimes I believe Miss Russell was in a movie of his, and he
I believe you're right.
Yes, he could not stop fussing with her top, shall we say. He felt it didn't look quite right, and he made a special bra for her and so on. But so he could become perfectionistic in a way that wasn't so useful. But in many, many instances, it made him really the top of his field, the top of his game in whatever he was doing.
It's interesting because you see the evolution of him here too, in a way that's not always happy in the end, because the Hells Angels' perfectionism, because he had the money, he was able to create this amazing movie. But then 20 years later, he's making a movie called Jet Pilot that he never can get done because the perfectionism has run almost rampant by that time, and it's interfering with his ability to ultimately wrap up some things.
Now, one thing that occurred between the earlier days where it seems like his perfectionism helped him really achieve, and later days where it seemed to sort of worsen in a way that he was more rigid and unable to use it to his advantage, is you could say that his OCD appeared to get worse, but really what happened is he had these two plane crashes, and the second one was really a terrible, terrible plane crash that he almost died. He had many broken bones, he had many third-degree burns, and he had a head injury, essentially, which one would think that kind of trauma to your frontal lobe probably caused some organic brain damage. And he, in those days, the ability to treat pain from broken bones, from burns, was not what it is today. And yes, they did treat him for pain, but there's the question of whether they treated him enough for pain, or whether he was sort of always. I know the big stories about Howard Hughes from The Aviator and so on is that he was like a drug addict, but really, I think the issue is more that his pain really wasn't able to be adequately managed, and it went on and on over time, and that would certainly worsen any other psychiatric symptoms you had. To be in chronic pain amplifies anxiety, amplifies depression.
Squeezes out a lot of other things you might want to think about and do. There's no doubt about it.
Exactly. So that the question of whether any brain trauma exacerbated his symptoms and made him worse, whether The pain that he was dealing with that went on made him worse may have also been at play, as in terms of him. At that point, he had peaked. He was so, successful in these two arenas, but then he started to make decisions that I think a lot of people questioned whether they were good ones or not.
Well, the two plane crashes really are pivotal. One was in World War II in Lake Mead near Las Vegas. And I actually interviewed a fellow who was on that plane when we did the book, who was still alive, living in Texas. And just talked about the whole process. I mean, because I guess one was killed in that plane.
Yes.
Hughes survived, a couple of other people survived, but it was obviously a major serious crash. But the worst one was 1946.
Right.
He had two defense contracts in World War II. One was the Spruce Goose. The other was a fighter plane. And a lot of Hughes's critics were claiming that he took this government money, but none of these things would ever fly. So the Spruce Goose he did fly in the late 40s. But before that, in 1946, he flew the fighter plane. And this is the one that crashed in Beverly Hills. There's a lot of theories as to why that happened, but the ultimate thing was he was almost killed. There's no doubt about it. And there's very little doubt that from then on he was subject to some forms of pain medication. The most detailed records we had on his pain situation, or at least his drug issues, were his last years.
Yes.
And the assumption is that those had been going on for many, many years. There's folks that wealthy can always find people to prescribe codeine and other things. And codeine was his preferred painkiller, which is a terrible thing. The side effects are quite difficult, which caused other problems. But it was sort of the peak, the late 40s. Though the funny thing is, we have this scene in the book, and actually the Aviator dealt with this as well. His appearance at the Senate hearings in the late 40s was truly kind of the high point of Hughes's life. Here's this guy he's not a recluse by that time, but he's
Right.
not out there that much, but he's seen around from time to time. He shows up at these Senate hearings like he goes to these things every day. And he just, every senator who questioned him, he had a platter and he just put their head on that platter. I mean, he just turned everything around with all of them in the cleverest kind of way, because he had this instinct for knowing exactly how that would play out in the real world. So as isolated as he was, as seemingly cut off from reality, he had this incredibly innate sense of what would work and what wouldn't work there. And then after that, though, he does start to progressively
decline.
withdraw more and more from public view. All through the 50s, he's seen less and less by the folks who run his various companies. And then by the late 50s, he totally withdraws from public view. The only people who see him are half a dozen, up to about a dozen in some cases, personal aides, not
Right.
CEOs. And actually we
Well-
can talk about that in some ways, because one of the things that fascinated us about him, and here with Don and I mean, we've done, stories on the oil crisis and criminal justice. When we went into the story about Hughes, we thought all of these stories about these problems, these physical problems, it can't be true. I mean, how's a guy like this run all these companies? That was what was so interesting to us about Hughes. He, with the folks who were really important, the CEOs of Hughes Tool Company, the lawyers who represented him, the folks who ran TWA, his big airline was TWA, he talked to them like he was the most rational, sensible person around. He might have a request every once in a while that would be hard to fulfill, but what's different between that and some other CEO, right?
Right.
But in terms of all these physical idiosyncrasies and the way he's dressing, his obsessive compulsive practices, they were unaware of these things. But the guys immediately around him were sort of sworn to secrecy on that. They knew all about it.
Well,
And
actually,
that's what's interesting, the way he was able to compartmentalize.
He
this.
compartmentalized.
Just we
Right.
couldn't get over it. We kept thinking somebody
Right.
must really be aware of this stuff, but as far as we could tell, they weren't.
So one thing that's kind of tragic, though, is that at the end of the day, as he came into life and as he went along, the people close to him, so to speak, were people either that he paid or that worked for him. I mean, that in other words, they were the CEOs or people that he surrounded himself, that he paid to do things for him. And he really didn't have close friendships. He was not able to really intimately connect with people. And so true also in the world of women. He was married, well, we know for sure of 2 times. He had this first wife that he married right away, Rice, from Rice University, from this very well-to-do family and an academic family, philanthropic family. But he ultimately divorced when he went out to Hollywood with her, and she ultimately left. It sounds like it wasn't a wonderful relationship for her.
She couldn't compete with the 80 World War I airplanes he bought. That was the problem. He got totally obsessed with making the movie Hell's Angels.
Well, see, he got
Ella Rice.
obsessed with things, but
Yes.
he really couldn't
Right.
connect with people or with women. Though what was amazing is how many women were around. So it sounds like being married, that didn't stop him from being with many, many women, many starlets. He had this marriage. He had a very multi-decade marriage, although at the end when she finally... Jean Peters, when she asked for a divorce, she had not seen him in years,
Right.
let alone, I mean, barely had occasionally spoken to him on the phone, apparently. And then there was the question of a third marriage that you said really there was never substantiated. I guess she came forward after he was dead looking for some money, saying that they were married at sea, that no one happened to see that. But they gave her somebody to go away, so it's wondered whether she was another wife. But there were so many women, which I think is so... There was something obviously so charismatic about him. I mean, he was very good looking. But beyond that, I mean, as you said, he put himself into fields that were fame-getting.
Right.
So Hollywood, very sexy,
Glamorous,
flying a plane, very
absolutely.
sexy.
Yeah.
And there was woman after woman that he didn't always pursue. They often pursued him. But the most famous women of Hollywood, Betty Davis, Katharine Hepburn, said he was a great love of hers. Ava Gardner, and just incredible. There was Olivia de Havilland and her sister. There were just so many women that he was involved with.
And then the last 15 to 20 years of his life, none, basically. I mean, even though he's married to Jean Peters during that time, we calculated that of their, I was trying to remember, they married 13 years, I think. They lived together 9 months of those 13 years. They was in a house in Rancho Santa Fe, San Diego County. And Jean wasn't really crazy about that 9 months, though, because Howard insisted they put a teletype machine in the bedroom. That's a real winner, isn't it, in any kind of relationship? But anyway, thank heaven for that, because all these things were saved and found their way into various court proceedings. But so what kind of a person early in his life, women seem to be important, and then late in life, they're not important at all. And I think it gets back partly
to the mother.
The mother, and also Hughes felt he needed no one.
Right.
And when he was young, in a way, he didn't need anybody, I suppose.
Which really has to do with his mother as well. So I think that to some degree, right, he was intensely looking for his mother, looking for that relationship where he would feel safe and loved, and he, there was woman after woman in a way. And yet, at the end of the day, he really couldn't trust any of them. He couldn't really be with any of them. I think when someone loses their mother at 17, fears of abandonment, and also, is it safe to be intimate? Because really, when he had his mother, he was really subsumed by his mother. I mean, she took over his mind and his body in certain kinds of ways.
And then she bailed.
And then she bailed.
Not by
not by design, not by choice, right?
design.
But right, exactly. And so I think he must have had just tremendously conflicted feelings about the safety of being with women, and yet he sometimes did these incredibly generous. I forgot which actress he didn't actually get involved with, but she ended up having a baby that was it Jean? No, not Jean Harlow. She had a baby who was she had. Rubella during her pregnancy. And there was a child born who was deaf and blind, and he took care of that child for the rest of, even though that wasn't a sexual relationship of his. Apparently with Russell, he never got physically involved, but they stayed friends. He kept her contract after he sold that Hollywood studio. So he made these relationships, but at the end of the day, I think no one got to really know Howard Hughes.
That is so true. And what's interesting is how many of the corporate people actually stayed with him, even though most of them did not see him. The folks at the tool company in Houston, for the most part, long relationships, and he didn't meddle with them up to a point. That was true at Hughes Aircraft Company as well. TWA, the airline, he did meddle with some of those folks from time to time, but the people immediately around him, the personal aides, many of those folks were with him for years and years. I mean, he set up, one of the ways he set up to insulate himself from people, he created this thing called operations in West Hollywood. And basically, the building was an old bakery. And on the second floor of it, you had a dispatcher's area, just like a police headquarters, where people would call in, and they would say, the head of the tool company would say, I need to talk to Howard. Here's the memo. They would dictate that. They would call Howard. They would tell him the memo, and then he would either dictate it or he would call the guy. But everything flowed through operations. It was just this channel that he used to kind of control the empire, so forth. But the people who manned that, some of them went to work for him right out of school and stayed with him to his death. Have never spoken, basically. I think one of them wrote a book at some point after his death, but essentially most of them never have discussed this in any detail. We were able to piece all this together because there was a lot of litigation after his death because he didn't leave a will. And there were depositions, there were court testimony, all of these people, multiple jurisdictions. It's an exciting life being an investigative reporter, right? Reading things like that. I mean, see that wall over there? The depositions and the trial transcripts would cover that wall, the litigation over the years involving him. And that was the source of us being able to piece together, especially his last years.
So he had all these, in fact, these relationships. He, in the later years when he moved from hotel to hotel and traveled, he would rent out the whole shebang, so to speak, and keep people there. He kept people who worked for him there. He kept old mistresses there. He kept sometimes his wife there. But it was sort of everything at an arm's length, right? Everybody should be with him, but not in the same room, so to speak.
Other than these half a dozen guys who alternated the round-the-clock shifts, absolutely.
And so there were the Senate hearings. This is sort of him on the set, him with his businesses, the Hughes Institution.
This is in the middle of this is the mid-20s filming Hell's Angels.
And some of those.
This is the inside of the Spruce Goose.
He also pushed the limits in Hollywood.
This is the Senate hearing, yeah.
Right, by making Scarface, by making films that really pushed
the
censors at that
absolutely.
point.
And he loved that. I mean, he actually was baiting the censors. That was another one of Howard's tricks. It wasn't by accident that he, I can't remember the movie now, but one of these in particular was particularly over the line in terms of the Catholic code. So where does he open the movie? In St. Louis, one of the most Catholic cities in America. So, I mean, Howard knew what he was doing. I mean, he knew how to jerk everybody's chain when when that was his mission.
And that actually seemed like it was a real feature of his personality.
Oh, yeah.
That he liked to sort of buck authority.
Oh, yes.
Break the rules, make his own rules.
Right.
And again, that served him well. I mean, we saw things change in Hollywood as a result, and we saw things change in the field of aviation as a result. But these accidents took a toll on him psychologically, physically. He actually grew that mustache because he had a scar.
Cuts up there, yeah.
And he was rather a vain man in addition, which is so interesting when people are confused then why, when he started to have this descent into being very isolated, which he still ran his businesses by phone when he was isolated, but why he did the bizarre things that he did. And I think many people think that it is the obsessive compulsive disorder, but really, if you take a look at the material and the fact that he, for instance, locked himself up and watched a movie over and over again and would not cut his nails, would not cut his hair, would not even bathe. And you think, well, how does that make sense with obsessive compulsive disorder and being afraid of germs? It doesn't. It probably has more to do with the condition called allodynia, where when someone has chronic pain due to something real, they can develop a pain syndrome that causes them to feel pain to things that wouldn't cause pain to someone else. So cutting your nails shouldn't hurt. But for someone with allodynia, which may have been tripped up by having real pain in the first place, cutting your nails would hurt. Bathing would hurt. Touch would hurt. And so for a man who already didn't like to be touched too much or didn't like people in his space, he moved to being so removed where he wouldn't wear clothes. I mean, this really fits with someone who can't tolerate touch and finds it painful. He sat in this darkened room, light bothered him, no nail trimming, no hair trimming, no washing, and just, having a napkin over his genitals, essentially like, don't touch anything. And then there was this current of the OCD where tissues needed to be used which is that is actually a frequent symptom for people who have a germ fear as part of their OCD, to use tissues to touch things because that will protect you. But he had these people surrounding him who really supported him in doing all of that.
And they didn't say, Howard, that's kind of crazy. That's kind of silly. And I think, and that's one of the things why we all sort of need somebody else at some point, because I suppose we all have various tendencies that every once in a while somebody ought to say, wake up here. That's not the way to go. The interesting thing on the OC, can I tell you a little story about this? Because again, when we got into this whole thing, we couldn't quite believe he was, in the end, in a way as disturbed as he was, because he would hear about these phone calls he would make where he would tell everybody everything's fine, and he'd laugh at the stories that I have long fingernails, when in fact he did have the long fingernails. So what's going on here? How does he make the separation? Well, one of the folks who we got close to in this process was a lawyer for the estate who represented a couple of the heirs, and he was frankly horrified at the way Hughes had been sort of neglected in his last years. And he called us one day when we were still working on the book, and I happened to take the phone at the time, and he was a wonderful guy. He'd been a civil rights lawyer in Alabama, and he said, Steele, what if I told you that I have a manual of the asylum? He used to refer to the Hughes, wherever he was living, as his asylum. What if I told you that this thing was 200 pages long, and it spelled out in detail everything to be done for him? How to open a door, how to open a can of fruit, how if somebody in the Empire died, and if you send flowers, you make sure that florist doesn't send a bill to any company of ours. Make sure we never use that florist again because we don't want the backflow of germs. Would you like to see that? I said, yeah, I'd like to see that. So I've never forgotten that. I flew to Houston, and there it was. It was called the Procedures Manual. All of these things were codified by these guys around him, catering to the wildest kind of insane behavior.
But these were his rules.
These were his rules, and they were not countermanding these. They were just putting them in writing so that we all know what's there. But see, he did not play that game with the president of Hughes Tool Company. He did not play that game with his Wall Street lawyers. He didn't play that game with folks who he considered his equals, in a way. He only played that game with those guys immediately around him who would cater to every one of these whims.
To some degree, it's the beginning of, or reminiscent of, today's the problem with celebrity, right? That when you can afford to,
yeah, right,
and you're surrounded by people who want to keep their jobs, they support your drug habit, your
Yeah, I mean,
whatever crazy
Elvis,
behavior.
Michael Jackson. I mean, yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
They don't challenge you. And so they procured whatever pain medications he said he wanted.
Right.
And they, would keep him housed wherever he wanted. Apparently, at some point, he decided he liked banana ripple ice cream, and they tried to get him and they said, well, we've discontinued that flavor. We would have to make a minimum order of 200 gallons. And
No
they
problem.
said, bring it on. So then apparently a few days later, he said, I don't like banana ripple anymore. Now I'm on to another flavor. So, but the insanity of that, which really wasn't him, it was a phenomenon that we still, unfortunately people fall prey to, that when you have a system whereby people are going to get paid and so on, that you may reinforce the worst of behavior.
Right. That's exactly right. And I think that's exactly what happened to him, the folks immediately around him. And these depositions that I just talked about a minute, there's all kinds of references to them basically catering to every one of these things.
And he didn't have any real friends,
Right,
or a
and-
real wife, or real somebody to say, you're not paying me, and I'm here to tell you because I
you need
love
some
you.
help here. Yeah,
Yes.
you need some help. And
Yes.
it's like when he was young, he felt he didn't need anybody. He could sort of buy what he needed, or he was strong enough on his own.
Right.
But at a certain point in his life, he really did need somebody, and nobody was there.
And I guess the question of whether he would have been able to trust
Right.
somebody,
That's-
because of course trust was a big issue for him, remains to be seen. And in fairness, treatments for obsessive compulsive disorder in those decades, there really wasn't much
Right.
of anything. So hence, pain medications were not what they are today. Our understanding of treating pain is not what it is today. That probably could have been treated much more effectively when I think on autopsy they found like 5 needles broken off in his arm. He would give himself intramuscular injections of codeine, which just goes to show that that's not about being a drug addict, because that is not an intravenous injection, which if you wanted to get the high of
Yeah,
cocaine,
there's an
you
easier
would
way
have
to do this.
you would have given yourself IV cocaine. But he was really trying to treat his pain, and probably it was only minimally effective, since codeine isn't that effective. And you can only imagine what kind of pain someone was in, that they would, needles would be broken off and lost in their arm. But they got him those supplies, and really the treatments, other treatments available. It's not like there wasn't a wonderful option in those days.
And usually the kinds of doctors who do that are not engaging in other practices. I
Yeah.
mean, they're just totally
Suppliers.
for the celebrity, whoever it is.
Well, I want to make sure that I get to some of your questions here for Jim. Do we know why he went to boarding school if their relationship was so important?
That's a good question. I think the family, and I'm just guessing on this because none of the documentation ever indicated exactly why that was, but I think they felt, they had aspirations for him to be really somebody, and he was obviously a smart kid. And what you very often did in Houston and parts of the South like that, where there weren't always the boarding schools, like you might find now, you sent them somewhere in the East or the West. And he went to one in Massachusetts called Fessenden, which is still in existence, and I believe, and a pretty famous boarding school. And then he went to the other one in Santa Barbara, California, which was also pretty well known at the time. So I think it was more
It was the right thing to do as a parent.
They had the money to do it. They wanted to expose him to some other things. And I think they were also a little bit concerned that he wasn't as social as he should have been, though I'm not sure that would be the way to do it. But and I think there's plenty of evidence that they visited him, at least the mother did,
Yeah, frequently.
in these places. So
Why was the film The Aviator so lopsided or even inaccurate in portraying him? Seems that he was interesting enough in reality. Did the writers actually believe this portrayal? I don't know if you know much about the background of writing of that, but
I guess I'd like to know what the inaccuracy people, one person's inaccuracy is another person's accuracy, and I'm just
Well, I mean, I do think that they really emphasize the OCD aspect, which
Well, here's what I think they were doing. Our book has actually been optioned a couple of times. A movie's never come about, partly because you've got this dichotomy with Hughes. You've got this dramatic early life with all kinds of interesting things, and then you've got this life at the end, which is very sad, and people have trouble reconciling that. So I think what Scorsese was trying to do was to look ahead. In other words, give him his due on the aviation, but down the road we see some problems. And my memory is at the end of the movie you saw kind of these shadowy figures who he was looking at, who were kind of representing those aides who would be around him. I assume that's what he had in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he was trying to project as to what was going to happen, because I guess without some of that, then you don't have the full picture.
yeah.
I mean, the seeds of his problems were there at the time. They just weren't full blown yet.
Well, I think if you ask me, when you're trying to make a movie that people will come see, you want drama, you want
sex appeal
and
of
you
some
want
sort,
some
yeah.
downfall, and so I think they overplayed the end in relation to his whole life because it's not so exciting. People aren't as likely to come see a movie where you're hearing about a person's many interesting successes. And I also think that the story that ended his life, which really was tragic, I mean, they really weren't able to recognize him at the end. They had to actually take fingerprints because he was 6'4" but 90 pounds.
94 pounds, yeah.
He
And
was
needles broken off in his arms.
emaciated,
Yeah.
wasted away, unrecognizable. And that's horrific, but I think that the explanation, which are these multi-factors. Yes, there was the OCD, but probably there was this pain syndrome that was untreated. There was the use of codeine, probably at a level that wasn't reasonable because that's all he had, and he had really the intimacy problems. I mean, he was a brilliant man, but his intimacy problems ended up really creating a very lonely, unsupported, tragic ending for him. And I think that that's a complicated picture. And movies, as Howard
Keep it
Hughes
simple.
like to be
Right.
linear.
Right.
Right?
That's true.
In keeping with what he did.
That's true.
How did his estate resolve?
Oh, this is an interesting question. Don and I actually wrote about this at the time before the book came out when we were at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And we actually put together a family tree that showed where the money would go. And this was back in the year he died, 76, 77. And essentially that is where the money ultimately went. He had aunts and uncles. I think it was a total of about 17 heirs. And that's where the money went. There were all kinds of people who came out of the woodwork. I'm Howard Hughes' son. He met my mother in Tokyo on a trip, and you can't believe how many of those letters we've gotten over the years. We still get them, by the way. And but
Actually,
because
it's
everybody
amazing
wanted
for as many women as he supposedly stupped, that there is no. I mean, it is. You kind of wonder about that, right? There were, so you wonder.
But sometimes none of the dates work out because
Right.
Because sometimes we were able to. Howard's very methodical, especially on his flight logs and things of that sort. So you could actually trace a lot of that stuff. But anyway, the family got it. One of his nephews stepped up to head what was left of his kind of holding company called Summa in Las Vegas. And the nephew actually did a really good job of expanding the wealth of the overall company, because a lot of Hughes's money was sort of tied up in land. He had bought all kinds of land in and around Las Vegas, and the nephew sold all of this before Las Vegas went to hell. The last, 4 or 5 years. So that was one. Hughes Aircraft was another one of his great assets that was sold. All of that money went to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, making that one of the largest foundations in the United States, actually in the world for that matter.
It still is. Still is. And actually, it was originally run by Howard Hughes' doctor.
Yes.
Which was interesting because he wasn't exactly qualified to do that, but he, again, in keeping with keep your inner circle and have your inner circle run things.
Right.
but ultimately, but it is today really
It's a huge foundation and does a lot of
amazing
very
work.
impressive work, much more than at any time when Hughes himself was actually alive. But again, this is sort of a carrying out of that goal. So a lot of the family members did very well. There were no significant challenges to that family tree. Well, there were challenges to it, but none of them were accepted. So just the blood relatives. There were two relatives who his uncle, children his uncle had adopted, that also were added to it later on. But
And interesting, this woman, Terry Moore, was able to come out of the woodwork and claim to have married him.
she was the nautical marriage. She was married on the boat offshore, which is a very popular place to get married and preserve the.
Well, believable in his
Preserve
odd
the records.
life and relationships. Was Howard Hughes' OCD solely caused by his mother, not genetic? So, I mean, this is, I'll just, OCD today we understand probably has a genetic component, and we don't, it's not that there's a gene, but it does run in families,
Yeah.
as do other anxiety disorders. So it sounds from what has been pieced together that his mother had OCD.
She certainly had a lot of tendencies that way.
Yes.
There's just no doubt
It was
about
not diagnosed at that time because nobody made those diagnoses,
Right.
but it sounded likely. And you also mentioned to me earlier that his father's
his grandmother on his
mother-
father's side also had a significant fear of bugs and germs, and was constantly fumigating her closets and things of that sort. I mean, that on itself is not totally bad.
You
but
can't make a
but when you
diagnosis
start,
that way, but
when you
you-
start coupling it with the other side of the family, and you say these
so you
two
question,
streams going
right.
on, you
So
do
there
wonder.
probably is some biologic loading, and in addition, obviously, that gets reinforced as a child, that you
Right.
would be told, don't do this, you'll get sick, don't step in that puddle, don't, one must, separate your peas and things like that would definitely have an impact. And in fact, I think at some point in his hospitalization following one of the plane crashes, he believed that it was fresh squeezed orange juice
Right.
that healed him, essentially, nothing else. And so this is, I think, so representative of his life. Fresh squeezed orange juice that he had to watch the orange being squeezed into the glass to see the juice. He had to see it happen. On the one hand, you could say, oh, that's real impairment, because you might not get good medical care if you're dependent on orange juice. On the other hand, while he was in the hospital bed, he designed a hospital bed that he thought would have been important for the kinds of things that he was struggling with, burns and difficulty being touched and having pain. He designed a hospital bed that he didn't get to use, but became the prototype for the hospital beds that you see today, where the leg goes up and the patient can control the head and so on. What we take for granted was really a design of Howard Hughes. And I think that just exemplifies, that he had this fine mind, and he had this ability to persevere even under tremendous duress and use his mind to create something really special, spectacular, and at the same time, he still struggled with these symptoms.
Yeah, he was a tinkerer on a small scale and then ultimately a big scale his entire life. So, it fits that he would be working around with everything from Jane Russell's bra to the hospital bed to a plane that's bigger than any plane you ever saw in your life. I mean, that's part of the whole picture of this guy.
But
And,
created these things that...
Pardon me?
Like one of the other things that we see regularly in our kids that we wouldn't know, like a hospital bed or a chair or a microphone, like the other things that
Most of his stuff, I think, was
Well, the aircraft certainly,
most of
many
most
of
of the
those...
stuff in aviation, and a lot of aviation has gone beyond that now. But at the time, it was really quite pivotal.
But some of the things that he did in movies that, were really originally his ideas, and of course in aviation were
Right.
originally his ideas.
Well, we talked about.
He kept that, but he actually continued to
Right.
lease his father's drill bits, but I don't think he invented more in that arena. But
Well, you're talking about the OC issues. The estate actually hired a psychologist.
To do a
Ra-
retrospective autopsy, right?
Raymond Fowler, who spent a long time looking at this. And Ray's a very interesting fellow. And he came to the general conclusion, as I recall, that whatever Hughes' illness was sort of somewhat unique to him. Because somebody who was obsessed by some of these issues as he was, usually was then not able to have as lucid a conversation as he was capable of having. And he said most people who had some of these manifestations were close to being psychotic, but he was not psychotic. So I hate to be so vague about this because I'm not professionally trained as you are in terms of the way you divide these things up, but Ray at the time felt Hughes' ailment was quite unique to him, which sort of fits with the man. Everything else was kind of one of a kind.
He certainly had a unique constellation of things going on, but he also had, I think, a unique set of strengths
Yeah.
that that some people struggling with this might not be able to surmount. But I think some of the very things that plagued him, the flip side of them, made him tenacious and driven and ambitious.
Right.
And those same things, and because he did have the means and because he had the intelligence, he was able to use those strengths, I think, to really, uniquely position himself and be really one of the great accomplishers.
You know, one question you asked a second ago, it just occurred to me I can elaborate on that a little bit more. It wasn't so much very often what he invented himself, but he would often pull together the kind of environment that was very creative. And Hughes Aircraft, which became this amazing defense contractor, was typical of that. He brought all kinds of people in and said, okay, study this, see what you come up with. And for the most part, he left them alone. And Hughes Aircraft, for a long time, became this really astonishing place to work. So they were into satellites, a whole range of very, very high-tech things. They were the only defense contractor, I think, in the top 10 who was basically private back in the 60s and 70s. After his death, they were first sold to General Motors. Mm-hmm. And then somebody else has bought them, I think, since then. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so it's not just what he sometimes looked down and created, but he set the table. And then out of that would grow some pretty amazing developments sometimes.
We're going to have to stop, but I see a couple of quick questions, so we'll try to. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes, in Houston.
He was buried with his parents. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
I get the impression that none of the members of his inner circle ever went public, either during his lifetime or since his death.
During his lifetime, they didn't. I think one of them later wrote some kind of a book, but I don't think anybody ever got.
Why do you think that is?
Seemed to engender a loyalty.
Well,
Right.
there were actually some criminal investigations after he died. And one of the doctors was actually criminally indicted, as I recall. Was then later, was not convicted. But there was a lot of litigation around the time of his death and for years afterward. A lot of it had to do with the estate.
And some of
And
the
I think
things
a lot-
people procured for him, they didn't do so
Yeah,
legally.
And I think a lot of those immediately around him were probably didn't want to talk about this in great detail. I'm sure they were taken care of also at some point by the estate. But you're right. I mean, normally you're going to see kind of a raft of tell-all books over something like that.
But I'd
But-
also like
but-
to say times have changed. Today,
Yeah.
you would see tell-all
Yeah.
books
I
because
mean,
everybody wants to make their buck that way. But
Even Elvis, I mean, there weren't too many tell-all books.
right,
with
but I
the
was going to say,
doctors,
in
right,
those
even
days,
around
there was
him.
a certain feeling of, not doing that to someone who died and had taken care of you in life.
And I think there were legal issues too, because it's like the 94 pounds. And
Right. How had
you
they
know.
let him?
how am I going to explain
road.
that?
Yeah.
Somebody else had, yes.
Oh, that's actually a picture because no one actually has. I mean, that's actually a drawing. No one
Oh,
has
yeah.
pictures of him. No one actually. I don't think he allowed himself to be, photographed
No, no.
in that time.
No photographs toward the end there.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming.
Enjoyed visiting.
Thank you so much. And we are gonna. I'll hold on to him for a little bit longer to sell some books
If
outside.
anybody would like, we have a few books here. If anybody
Yep.
would care for one.
Love that.